Welcome, everyone. My name is Akasemi Newsome, and I'm Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies here at UC Berkeley. We're honored to have you all here today for the final installment of our German and European History lecture series. The speaker that we're featuring is Professor Wolf Gruner. This discussion will then be moderated by Professor John Efron on faculty here as Court Professor of Jewish History. I would be remiss if I did not thank our partners, the German Historical Institute Pacific Regional Office and the DAD for its support of our lecture series. A bit about our speaker. Wolf Gruner is the Shapell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at the University of Southern California. In 2014, he became the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, previously the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. He's a specialist in German Jewish history, Holocaust, and comparative genocide studies, topics on which he authored 10 books and over 70 articles and book chapters. His most recent publication is the prize-winning Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, Czech Initiatives, German Policies, and Jewish Responses that came out in 2019. He just finished a book manuscript, Impudent Jews, Forgotten Stories of Individual Resistance in Hitler's Germany. He also co-edited 4 volumes, including Resisting Persecution, Jews and Their Petitions During the Holocaust, which came out in 2020. Now, without further ado, I will cede the floor to Professor Wolf Gruner for his presentation, and then Professor John Efron will kick off the discussion with some questions. Thank you. The floor is yours, Professor Gruner.
Thank you very much. First of all, to the audience who came to this talk. Second, to the Institute for European Studies here at Berkeley, the Center for Jewish Studies, and also to the German Historical Institute Pacific Branch for this invitation, which I happily accepted, especially if there was a possibility to do it actually in person. Although it turned out now it being more hybrid, but nevertheless, I'm happy to be here. So this talk is about resisting persecution, Jews and their petitions during the Holocaust. The title is borrowed from the already mentioned book, which I co-edited together with Thomas Pegelow-Kaplan, and which was published last year. We both met at a conference, and from very different research angles, we both agreed that historians, especially Holocaust historians, had kind of misjudged Jewish petitions during the Holocaust, and that there's a reassessment necessary. For me, from my research, which is over a decade now focusing on Jewish resistance, especially individual Jewish resistance, I try to kind of redefine what we understand under resistance in Nazi Germany. And this culminated in the just finished book manuscript, which was already mentioned. During the Third Reich, Gestapo, SS, and other state authorities complained endless times about impudent Jews. For example, in March 1935, the Gestapo in Aachen wrote in her report, quote, "The number of Jews who had sent letters and protested in person has become quite numerous, and they're in their tone often impudent." End of quote. Still in April 1940, during the war, the SS Reich Main Security Office emphasized in their report that it had received information from all corners of the Reich about the number of Jews with a very impudent attitude. Historians, including myself, have generally understood those frequent mentions of impudent Jews as a trope with the sole purpose of justifying new radical measures among Nazi authorities as a pretext to radicalize persecution. Yet, the impudent Jews was not just Nazi rhetoric. In fall 1942, that means way into the war, 1,200 Jews were imprisoned in Nazi Germany for political and criminal offenses. Hence, for the rediscovery of such forgotten acts, a reassessment of, generally speaking, Jewish reactions and responses towards persecution is necessary. During the last decade, my research revealed that hundreds and thousands of Jews actually actively opposed Nazi persecution. And as an important element of this large variety of individual acts of defiance, in my presentation, I will kind of give you first an understanding why I think it was kind of underestimated in research, under-researched, and also what the reasons for this kind of neglect was. And then second, I will give you an overview how German, Austrian, and Czech Jews challenged Nazi persecution with petitions in 1933 and 1945. So first, a little bit about the development of the research. Until now, the public, but also many Holocaust scholars, subscribe to the idea that Jews in general, but specifically German Jews, did not really resist the terrors of the Third Reich. The traditional perception of their passivity is nourished by the fact that historians have discussed Jewish resistance during the Holocaust mainly in terms of organized group resistance and armed resistance. In the beginning of the 1960s, Hannah Arendt, Bruno Bettelheim, and Raoul Hilberg all emphasized the alleged lack of Jewish resistance. Although these assessments at the time were immediately questioned by Israeli scholars, and thereafter moral and cultural resistance played a role in the discussion about resistance, nevertheless, in general, academia settled on an understanding of Jewish resistance as armed resistance, group resistance, and mainly occurring in Eastern Europe. So, and this one can actually see in recent exhibitions like in the Wiener Library or also in publications like Yevgeny Finkel's Ordinary Jews. So from my standpoint, a systematic evaluation of individual resistance is missing in almost all prominent Holocaust narratives, even those who focus on the integration of Jewish voices, like the important works of Saul Friedlander. Two main reasons may explain this unexpected void. One is a restricted conceptual approach, and the second one is a restricted or limited source base. I'm doing nothing kind of original here. I actually only revive previous attempts by scholars like in the 1950s, the Israeli scholar Meir Dvoretsky, the survivor, and then in the 1970s, the Australian historian Konrad Creed and an East German survivor Helmut Eschwege. They all already tried to open up the understanding of Jewish resistance towards individual activities. Such anti-Nazi attitudes like nonconformity, defiance, and protest were also discussed in the 1980s in a general discussion about German resistance in the Third Reich. And similar ideas were developed kind of beyond just looking at the Holocaust, for example, by the anthropologist James Scott and scholars working on US slavery. So based on such a broader conceptualization, I amended a well-known definition and widely used definition by Yehuda Bauer about Jewish resistance. And I added just one word, individual. And then it reads, quote, any individual or group action in opposition to known laws, actions, or intentions of the Nazis and their helpers is Jewish resistance. End of quote. Such a broader approach immediately uncovers a wide variety of individual Jewish actions, ranging from breaking Nazi laws to protesting in public. Calling this resistance seems especially justified because Jews were exposed to several parts of persecution, political persecution, racial persecution. And they were especially vulnerable because they were losing over time any civil rights and support. So doing my research over the last 12 years, I identified 5 prominent types of Jewish resistance, individual Jewish resistance. A, contesting Nazi propaganda. B, oral protest. C, written protest. D, defying anti-Jewish laws and regulations. And E, physical self-defense. For my talk, or for this research, I have to say, I want to mention that while I use this broader conceptual approach, I also use a very different source base than previous research has done. So I actually went to local police sources, local courts in Germany, in dozens of cities, and I added a thorough investigation of video testimonies of survivors from the Shoah Foundation, over 170 of them. And this research unearthed a large amount of evidence, and for all of these different types, but especially also for the type written protest. And here we have a range from anonymous leaflets to petitions as individual acts of opposition. Every local, regional, and state archive on the continent houses collections with dozens, sometimes hundreds, yeah, even thousands of petitions and entreaties. Every researcher who does Jewish history or Holocaust history has found evidence of those, and especially noted their abundance. In the light of this magnitude of evidence, it is striking and even problematic, in my view, that for the broader understanding of Jewish responses during the Holocaust, petitions have been neglected, or sometimes even outright dismissed by Holocaust scholarship. For example, Raoul Hilberg even used the enormous number of entreaties to make his case for the alleged absence of actual Jewish resistance. Quote, everywhere the Jews pitted words against rifles, dialectics against force, and everywhere they lost, end of quote. By contrast, in the 1970s, Konrad Kviet and Helmut Eschwege started their book chapter on nonconformity by German Jews with a thorough description of written interventions as forms of open protest. Hence, it is time to place these petitioning practices at the center of our analysis, as the volume I mentioned in the beginning, which I co-edited with Thomas Pegelow-Kaplan, does. And we need to take these petitions seriously as important Jewish responses during the Holocaust. And this counters previous kind of understandings where historians have reduced petitions of Jews to futile attempts of getting exemptions from racial definitions. However, they are much, let's say they have a much larger content than just to get exempted from certain restrictions. And a lot of the context is that of the neglect is that people thought these petitions were written in vain. They were rejected. Jews didn't achieve anything. However, if we think that requesting exemption is already a form of agency, and even in opposition to the Nazi state's plans of defining or redefining individuals. So why are petitions important? In non-authoritarian societies, as in the West, it is hard to imagine that writing letters to a government might have any noticeable impact. In light of the countless means we have at our disposal to kind of let our political impact thrive. However, in a dictatorship, interactions between the government and the people work very differently. Any public or private criticism produces danger of being punished by law or even extrajudicial means. Moreover, in Nazi Germany, the Jews were excluded from any political participation and representation. Therefore, entreaties often constituted the petitioner's only permissible expression of individual or collective opinion, while simultaneously also carrying considerable personal and collective risks. At the same time, communication with powerful individuals gained so much bigger significance in an authoritarian environment than in a pluralistic society, where different branches of power exist. Consequently, establishing such a channel of communication by employing petitions can be sometimes a more effective way to challenge discrimination than other forms of resistance. Moreover, Nazi responses to petitioners did demand the allocation of time, staff, and resources in processing these requests. As the research for the volume has shown, perpetrators took entreaties seriously, not only by processing them, but often by involving other agencies. Our book on Jewish petitions during the Holocaust, which includes chapters on Germany, the Protectorate, Poland, France, Hungary, and Romania, provides kind of a beginning of a reassessment of petitions for two main reasons. First, entreaties demonstrate Jewish agency. Second, petitions represent the sole political means which the Jews had at their disposal to countering their racial discriminatory redefinition as groups and individuals. Indeed, petitions sent by persecuted Jews to government, state administrations, local offices, or party agencies have been crucial in the struggle of Jewish individuals for self-determination, self-preservation, and ultimately survival. Let me now present you with a brief overview of how Jews used petitions to challenge or oppose Hitler's persecution. For German and Austrian and Czech Jews, the use of written petitions as a nonviolent action provided them with a means in a normally powerless situation. Individual Jews, as well as representatives of Jewish organizations, used petitions to formally protest anti-Jewish policies, whether in the public or the private sector. They did so to protect individual Jews or the Jewish population as a whole. Let us briefly look into the actions of representatives and functionaries of Jewish organizations. Soon after Hitler took power in 1933, representatives of Jewish organizations started to intervene directly at the government, at city offices, or with party functionaries against anti-Jewish policies. For example, the Jewish community of Berlin and the Reich Representation, a new Jewish umbrella organization founded in 1933, drafted a petition to the Reich Chancellery to stop the plans for a nationwide anti-Jewish boycott. In a similar vein, one day before the boycott in April 1933, Alfred Neumeier wrote a protest letter on behalf of the Association of Bavarian Jewish Communities. He underlined that the German Jews had always worked for Germany and that many thousand Jews had sacrificed their life for Germany during the war. Hence, such a petition did not only protest specific Nazi policies, but simultaneously challenged anti-Jewish propaganda, portraying Jews as non-Germans and enemies. In 1934, Leo Beck, the head of the Reich Representation, authored a large memorandum requesting that the defamation of the Jewish people in Germany cease and that the Nazi state abolish anti-Jewish measures in all spheres of life, which were listed in a printed 80-page brochure for German government consumption. Specific acts of discrimination or humiliation would trigger equal responses by the Reich Representation or Jewish communities. For example, a letter to the Reich Ministry of Defense protested against the exclusion of Jews from the German army in 1935. Leo Beck reminded the German ministry that 12,000 Jews lost their lives during the First World War. Local Jewish communities also intervened on a frequent basis. Heinrich Stahl, the president of the Berlin community, protested against early measures taken by the city government, which were not supported by any Nazi legislation. In his petition, he underlined the contribution of the Jews in Berlin to the prosperity of the city. Jewish representatives went often beyond just writing petitions or letters. They sometimes employed more sophisticated strategies and techniques, which researchers have hitherto overlooked. They would use petitions to pit different Nazi institutions against each other, kind of appealing to their different interests or authorities. For example, in 1933, the Jewish community of Essen submitted a petition to the Prussian Ministry of Interior requesting the restitution of a Jewish youth home, now occupied by Hitler Youth, after the Gestapo had confiscated it. It took a year and the involvement of the Reich Ministry of Interior and the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, that the local Gestapo finally admitted that they had no right to kind of confiscate the property. And in the end, the Gestapo had to return the building to the Jewish community. Several years later, the Reich representatives intervened at the Gestapo headquarters after the violent pogrom of 1938, because during the pogrom, all so-called retraining camps where Jewish youth were prepared for the immigration had been raided, destroyed, and the teenagers as well as their teachers had been arrested and they were brought into concentration camps. The Reich representation successfully drew on the Nazi interest in immigration of the Jews, and after a short while, the Gestapo headquarters issued a decree to release the educators from the concentration camps so that they could resume the preparation of Jewish teenagers for immigration. Even during the war, Jewish communities and their representatives could appeal to the conflicting interests of different authorities. So, for example, they could mobilize local Gestapo against labor officers who had people in forced labor. In other instances, ministries against municipalities in questions of food provision. And for example, in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, where a number of German and Czech authorities persecuted the Jews, in spring 1940, there were early local efforts by small towns in Bohemia to ghettoize the Jewish population, to bring them in old factories, to separate them in certain streets. While in many cases, these local efforts bear fruit, so they segregated the Jewish population. In some of the instances, when the Prague Jewish community intervened at Eichmann's office in Prague, they actually were successful in stopping these segregation efforts in one district and in one town. So this activism, this frequent petitioning by Jewish officials challenges our traditional understanding of kind of the behavior of Jewish communities under Nazi power. The Prague Jewish community, for example, was not a willing executioner of Eichmann's central office, or neither it was paralyzed under the total control of the Gestapo. Quite the opposite. Jewish representatives and employees undertook many efforts to ease and oppose effects of the persecution for the Jewish population. In the second part, I want to talk briefly about individual Jewish efforts which were not connected to any Jewish community or Jewish organization. Let's go back to 1933. Only practically 3 weeks after Hitler took power, a Jewish woman appealed to the German Reich president von Hindenburg to stop, quote, the public incitement to pogroms and violent attacks on Jews, end of quote. To bolster her protest, she ended with the simple line, quote, we are Jews and we have fulfilled our duty to the fatherland to the fullest, end of quote. Such petitions and their arguments were hardly exceptions. In 1934, Julius Fromm, a very well-known German Berlin Jewish merchant, complained to the Berlin police president that his citizenship had been revoked. He insisted on his Germanness and emphasized that his business success made him the biggest taxpayer in his Berlin district. He reiterated that he had fulfilled more than his duty to his country and the people's community. Many German Jews protested against their racial categorization as non-Aryans by the Nazi state, as Thomas Bigelow Kaplan has shown us, which they perceived as taking away their Germanness. In May 1935, when the government excluded Jews from military service, Paula Tobias wrote a fierce complaint to the Reich War Ministry about her son's ouster from the German army. She emphasized that her family had done everything for the German fatherland without asking for any compensation. While during the 1930s, many of the petitioners were men because they were more present in the business world and thus more affected by discriminatory economic politics after 1933. This changed after the violent pogrom of November with the mass arrest of German Jewish men. Wives, mothers, and daughters protested in many letters to local police and Gestapo offices in desperate attempts to free their male relatives from concentration camps. After the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in March 1938, many Austrian Jews protested against the increasingly radicalized persecution in Austria. They protested the eviction from Viennese rental apartments, for example, which occurred in 2 waves in 1939 and early 1940. And these petitions are especially numerous. For example, Arnold Goldner, who received a 48 hours notice to leave his home of 27 years, petitioned Nazi Gauleiter Berkeley in February 1940. He requested an exemption from the eviction because he was a disabled war veteran with several medals for his brave service. He signed the petition as Reserve Senior Lieutenant of Regiment number 26 in Marburg. Other entreaties in Vienna focused on deteriorating living situations. In a handwritten petition of March 1940, Heinrich Kindler requested from the Nazi party leader in Vienna to grant him and his wife the right to visit public parks, which were forbidden for a year for Jews. Similar petitions you can find in other cities, for example, in Leipzig. In May 1940, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's party deputy and Reich Minister without portfolio, received a petition from Hans Kauders in Vienna. Challenging the Nazi discriminatory view of Jews, Kauder described himself in this petition, quote, "I am Viennese born, married, without children, a captain retired, 60 years old, and I lived in Vienna all my life." Next, he mentioned the amputation of his left thigh, which had resulted in a 90% disability rate. Subsequently, he described in detail his war experience when he led battles at the Eastern Front, where he was wounded and captured by the enemy and kept as prisoners of war for 2 years. After his retirement, when he came back, he volunteered for the Reich War Ministry and gave hundreds of public lectures about his POW experience. For his volunteer work as a disabled veteran, he received several honors and medals. But the main reason for his petition was that after the annexation of Austria, he had lost his taxi license, his tobacco kiosk license as a Jew, which had provided his livelihood since 1917. He was forced since 1938 to live with his wife on a small veteran's pension. In addition, as a Jew, he was excluded from all cultural events and, as I already mentioned, from visiting public parks. He underlined that he was still close to his fatherland with all his heart and would love to serve in any capacity as he had done in the past. In his petition, he cited Hitler, who, after the annexation of Austria, had said in a public speech that, quote, "War disabled are the first citizens of the state." Hans Kauder requested from Hitler's deputy help in his desolate situation. He concluded his petition telling Hess that without being at fault, he, as an honored army officer, as a veteran and a truthful man, felt deeply hurt to be forced to live as a pariah. Let me conclude and summarize. So I think this research and also our volume shows that petition mattered. When we apply a wider definition of resistance that encompasses all individual Jewish activities against Nazi actions, ideas, and intentions, this research understands Jewish petitions as one element of a large array of the defined actions of Jews under Nazi rule. Despite the decade-old Saul Friedlander call for an integrated Holocaust history, including the full Jewish perspective, historians have yet to understand petitions as an integral part of the diverse and changing set of active Jewish responses under Nazi persecution. Based on research in Germany, Austria, and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, this research revealed how numerous functionaries of German Jewish organizations and communities, as well as kind of individual Jewish men and women, protested with petitions ranging from handwritten letters to printed memoranda. From 1933 onwards, thousands of such petitions were sent to local, regional, and ministry officials, the Nazi government, Hitler, and other high-ranking functionaries, but also private employers. Jews criticized Nazi laws and boycotts, violent attacks, and local segregation. Jewish individuals tried to take advantage, as well as functionaries of Jewish communities did, of the differing interests of different Nazi institutions. They tried to manipulate, and sometimes successful, Nazi party and state institutions. Moreover, the involvement of many local, regional, and national government and party agencies underline the fact that their written complaints were taken seriously by the perpetrators. Quite a few petitions generated the desired outcome. They stopped certain anti-Jewish measures, provided exemptions, provided access to resources, or secured exemptions from racial laws. Even at the height of the Holocaust, as I have shown, decisions were still made sometimes in favor of the petitioner, as we could see with the stop of ghettoization in some towns in Bohemia. At the same time, however, many entreaties were ignored, dismissed, or rejected by the addressed authorities. And this raises the question, what does really constitute success in this regard for the Jewish petitions? Is it just the positive response? Or should we actually look also that even when a petition was rejected, the time passing until the rejection provided opportunities for the individuals who tried to oppose certain measures. They could get a reprieve from the persecution or prepare, for example, to go into underground. In addition to challenging anti-Jewish measures, petitioners did not shy away from negating their racial classifications by the Nazis. Many Jews resisted in a way by not putting their discriminatory names on the letters, on the petitions, or using their ID numbers for Jews, which they were actually obliged to do. Instead, they listed their own titles, honors, and national awards on their letters. Moreover, many insisted on being regular and productive members of the society by underlining the facts that they always paid their fair share of taxes, participated in the nation-building process, and defended their country in previous wars. They called on their violated rights as workers, property owners, and citizens, and reclaimed political, cultural, and social positions in the dictatorship. Countless Jewish men and women put their opposition on paper and signed with their names, which made them vulnerable to personal repercussion, such as incarceration and violence. To understand such petitions as manifestations of protest and self-determination gives agency back to the victims of oppression. This is true not just for Germany or Austria, as I showed, but as the coedited volume shows in other parts of Nazi-occupied Europe as well. However, there needs to be much more exploration of this kind of opposition for other occupied countries in Europe. To appreciate and commemorate the courageous efforts of countless German Jews, our standard Holocaust narrative needs to be thoroughly updated by integrating individual resistance and, as our focus today showed, also petitions as accounts of Jewish resistance. Applying such a broader lens regarding resistance will help us telling a richer story of Jewish responses during the Holocaust. And when we look back that so many individual Jews resisted Nazi measures, renders older claims of their passivity obsolete once and for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gruner. When you began and you were speaking about the historiography, I was taken back in time. After I left Australia, having done my undergraduate degree, I went to the Hebrew University where I did a graduate seminar with Yehuda Bauer on Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. And I think I, like most other people in the class when it began, expected it to be largely about armed resistance, when in fact it actually only took up a very small portion of the syllabus, and most of it was came what he called sort of passive resistance was the term. There was nothing passive about it, but it was just as opposed to active armed resistance. And so this sort of leads me to a question that I'd like to sort of open up, and then we can invite questions from the larger in the room and also the larger audience. If you mentioned sort of 5 categories of resistance, one of which was obviously physical self-defense, and I'm wondering how you map the kinds of resistance you're talking about as sort of a typology onto the resistance of sort of physical resistance. And that is to say, did the petitioners, do you have any sense in the petitions that they really thought that these petitions would work? In the testimonies of many of the those who engage in armed resistance, they knew they were not going to defeat the Germans. I mean, if you look at the testimony of Mordechai Neilevich, for example, in Warsaw, before, he says it's about dying with dignity, and it's about taking as many Germans down as possible in the process. But it was not for the purposes of winning the war. You know, by the time armed resistance began, there was very little left for Jews to win. So I'm curious as to did they really think that they were going to be effective, and did their expectations, I think, change over time? It's different writing a petition in the middle of 1933 to writing one in the middle of 1936, 37, 38, and of course it just continues to get worse. So do you get a sense of an increasing sense of despair? What about the tone and the language? Is there a difference in tone and language used in the early days, and then as the situation progressed further in time? So I would start with those, and also just one other thing about language. You did make an allusion to the gender breakdown of the petitions. Is there a difference in language there between that of men and that of women?
Oh, thank you so much for this kind of set of questions. That's not just one. So I would first say I think we need to distinguish the kind of environments, because the environment in Germany and Austria and the protectorate was very different from Poland, because this was an invaded country. There was a war fought. So there was a very, the set of the course of the persecution was much more radical, much more deadly. For example, in Poland, you could be shot when you would leave your certain town. This was not happening in Germany. Yeah, so there's a different environment, and I think this speaks to the different also expectations of the German Jews or the Austrian Jews. There's a long tradition of petitioning first among the Jewish population, a long history, and then there's also kind of a tradition of petition within kind of in Europe itself, beyond just the Jewish population. So the understanding, what I guess a kind of sense is, they still understood Germany as a kind of legal state. And in this regard, their only possibility was to kind of appeal to these laws when they thought German laws were actually broken by the Nazis, or if the laws would kind of provide exemptions, then they would kind of discuss those. But in general, they thought this is a legal state. And they were actually not wrong, because sometimes in hindsight, we think backwards and we see kind of how brutal the persecution was towards the end of the war with the deportations and everything. But my research shows that, for example, still in 1941, a court in Germany would acquit a Jew when there was when witnesses would vouch for them, which is normally unsurprising, because we think at this late point in time, when the mass deportations already are going on, there's no way that that they get a free pass. The offenses were like publicly protesting against Hitler, for example, or against the persecution. So there was much more to a kind of a much more complex situation in Germany and Austria, and also partly in the protectorate, for these individual Jews. And I think this is what contributes that they assumed that these petitions had some kind of influence still. And they were not wrong, because as I tried to show, some of them were successful. So this is what I see. You asked about language over time. Language changes in a way kind of alongside the persecution. So that's kind of clear, because what they respond to changes also their vocabulary and so on. I would not say that this is kind of my sense, different from letters exchanges, where you see what you call despair. Actually, you see a drastic change after Kristallnacht in private letter exchanges, when until 1938, Jewish families would never mention any persecution. Suddenly, after 1938, they start kind of talking about there is forced labor, we have to leave our house, which doesn't happen in 1935 in this kind of in this way. Also, the tone is very different. In the petitions, not, because I think what we try to show in the volume is petitions are a very interesting form where you appeal to a perpetrator. You can't just offend the perpetrator, because then you will get no access. So research on the petitions showed that there is kind of an adoption of perpetrator language in a way. So to appeal to certain values like Germanness is a way to try to kind of to gain kind of bring the perpetrators to listen to you. So you can't get more kind of desperate in these letters, because you would not achieve anything with it. So I think that's what kind of shapes a little bit the language in these petitions, so that they are more constant than letter exchanges. And the last one, between men and women, interesting is that women use the same vocabulary as men. So there are, for example, women writing petitions, and they use exactly the same, like we fought for Germanness, we are kind of contributing to the state. So that's kind of the same patterns in these petitions, or similar.
How do we do this? Okay, so we have another question.
Thank you very much, Wolf, for this really interesting talk. I think it's really important, like your research and that you like try to highlight the Jewish agency and to like reframe the various efforts of Jews against Nazi Germany who spoke out and acted out, as it also like is part of my own research on Polish Jews who struggled against Nazi Germany. And I have like two questions for you. One question is like, in my own research, I found a lot of petitions like crafted by Polish Jews and sent out to Geneva, but also to Nazi Germany. And they were like part of this really strong anti-Nazi boycott and protest movement. And I want to ask you if you would also think or like support the idea that in general, as like historians of the Holocaust, that we maybe have to also look again on the international Jewish boycott movement against Nazi Germany and to reevaluate this movement, because I got the feeling also from discussions with other historians like that the mainstream historian view is also like kind of like downplay the efforts and the effects of this movement. And if we like have to look at it again, because they also like sent out a lot of petitions and they spoke out really strong against Nazi Germany. And the other question is if you also came across examples of resistance in Nazi Germany where Jews were supported by non-Jews, for example, if you were married to a Jew, or if also you found examples of like non-Jews who supported petitions or something alike.
Yeah, thank you for these interesting questions. So I think that there is a tendency to downplay international boycott measures has a reason, because the problem of boycott measures often is they sometimes radicalize the cause of the persecution. And if you emphasize the boycott, one needs to look at how did the Nazis respond to this. And I think that's a little bit the situation there. However, what I think you are right, we also need to reassess what happens, because it is not just about a political boycott, it is also about raising money to enable people to emigrate via international organizations. So there's a lot which actually is very helpful for the German Jewish communities. Got a lot of kind of cash injected when they were short on money, because they had now all these new areas where they needed to kind of provide welfare for the Jews, economic help, and so on. So this was really often life-saving, I have to say. So I think that's really important to reassess this. And these petitions helped in a way the communication. So I would, in our volume, we actually also have some examples of this where petitions also went outside of the country. And so this is important. And the other question is non-Jews. So I have to say that in my research on individual resistance, I found almost an equal amount of non-Jewish resistance against persecution. So as Jews protested against the persecution of themselves, there are quite a lot of non-Jewish Germans or Austrians who actually also protested. And they got equally tried in court for the political offenses. They got equally prison time. So that's another field which I didn't want to open up. And this is kind of needs really much more attention. So there is much more solidarity than we actually assume. And interestingly, what I can say from my research is the solidarity is not diminishing over time, what we normally assume because of kind of the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship, the kind of indoctrination, the people's community. What I can see, it's actually, it happens in waves and it responds to certain situations. So for example, the strongest pro-Jewish sentiments issued in kind of public protest by individuals is in 1938, which is interesting because 5 years after the Nazis took power, we would not expect this. So what is the reason? My explanation is there was a much more peculiar situation for the German population because there was a war loom. After the annexation of Austria, there was the crisis with the Sudeten and with the Czechoslovak Republic. So people thought there will be a war. And in a war, they might also fear losing again. And this changed their perspective how to treat the Jews. So this was very interesting that suddenly there's a spike in solidarity. And I think this is connected to the situation. So we have to look much more on the actual conditions and not think about this kind of very simplistic trajectory of how people behave. Regarding petitions, we have both, I have to say. We have non-Jewish Germans petitioning in favor of Jews or against the persecution, but we have also quite a lot of petitions where non-Jewish men and women try to get apartments, try to kind of denunciate Jews. So you have both sides present in the archives there. An interesting example, and an unexpected example, has Tim Cole in our volume, which are petitions regarding the segregation of Budapest Jews. And there you have petitions in one house, which is supposed to be, the Jews are supposed to have to leave the house. And then you have petitions from the non-Jewish tenants as well as the Jewish tenants to kind of claiming that they need to stay in this house. And suddenly it creates something, these petitions create a new form of a house, which are mixed houses, which were not in the Nazi plans or in the Hungarian plans there. Yeah, so they had thought about Jews houses and then Aryan houses, but suddenly they created mixed houses because this kind of will of the tenants was too strong to kind of overcome.
Let's quickly ask you, how long were these petitions? Were they extensive narratives? Or were they very brief? Were they formulaic?
So in general, we have petitions usually are going from 1 page TypeScript to 4 pages or 5 pages. Most of them are 1-2 pages, I would say, in what I have seen. And then some of them have also attachments. So you have, for example, certificates of of the previous life. You have honors there. So there's sometimes a document documents are attached to them. So that's then even more pages. So, and sometimes you have also just like 1 paragraph handwritten. Yeah.
My question is about other victims of the Holocaust. So, for example, communists or Roma. Did you see in your research in the archives other targeted, undesirable groups by the Nazis? Did they submit petitions as well? And also, did you see any evidence that there was any conversation across sort of different unprotected categories, if you will? So Jews referring to communists, or maybe Jews are communists, for example. I could see there could be overlap as well. Wondering about that. Yeah,
that's a good question. So the question was there also, did I find also petitions of other groups, persecuted groups like communists or Romani people? And I was very much focusing on Jewish victims in this regard. And so I even excluded Jews in mixed marriages, just to focus on really on Jews. But I saw in the archives that here and there were also petitions, let's say, of people who were oppressed by for political reasons.
There are 2 more questions from the chat, and then we will have to conclude.
Yeah. Okay, we have 2 questions in the chat. One from Christopher Jackson, who asks, to what extent were petitions brought under the aegis of the formal Jewish community? So you had mentioned that there had been individual and then communal petitions. Can you give us just a sort of a breakdown, perhaps?
Of how many? Or, oh,
yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah. You want to ask the last 2 questions at most. Okay, and then another one from Professor Marcuse. What was it like working in the local police archives? Where did they keep all for these petitions. And then,
So the local archives, where they kept these petitions?
yeah,
Okay.
yes,
Yeah.
also where the petitions were kept. And then our last question from Stefan Scholl. How would you place the petitions from Jews more broadly in the history of the communication between the population, Jewish as well as non-Jewish, and the regime during National Socialism? We've already alluded to that. What does the existence of petitions tell us about the perceptions that contemporaries had of the National Socialist state? And then finally, one person asks, can the petitions be viewed online?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good set of questions. So the first one, the percentage of collective, I would say, and individual, it's not so easy to tell because, for example, Jewish communities would draft petitions for individuals because a lot of the Jewish individuals would go to Jewish communities and seek advice, especially with the increasing persecution, not so much in the beginning, but later on we see this, that they seek advice, legal advice. Sometimes they get help. Sometimes the Jewish community represents a Jewish individual and intervenes at the ministry or so. So that's a little bit difficult. So, for example, I have numbers in Prague during the war in 1941. There were several hundreds kind of petitions letters drafted by the Jewish community, either for the community or for individuals. But in general, I think the number of the individual petitions far outnumbers the one of Jewish communities and Jewish organizations. Okay. So, yeah, because when I looked at, this leads into the second question about the archives. So petitions are usually found in the holdings of the recipient. That means if it is for the Reich Ministry of Justice, we will find these petitions in the Reich Ministry of Justice. The same is true for the police president in Berlin or the city government of Munich. So there is not a special repertoire. It is actually about the recipient where we find it. And usually there are files with tons of the petitions. For example, I cited the petitions in Vienna. These are 2 boxes of petitions only from a few months in 1940, which survived. That's also a question. Many of the things I referenced here are not kind of representative of all of those because we don't even know what kind of petitions existed. Because, for example, when I look at Vienna, I have only several hundreds from March, April, May, and I think June of 1940, just to the Nazi Gauleiter. And just because most of them are because of the eviction of homes. So I don't know what happened before, afterwards, at the same office, because they didn't survive. And I also don't know what other petitions were sent, for example, to the city government. So that needs much more research, much more thorough kind of systematic research, because in a way we came to this because Thomas and I, doing our research, we noticed the kind of neglect of this form of response. Then the question was petitions
in the local police archives.
Oh, local police archives. Yeah, in the local police archives, I use them extensively, but there you find much more kind of notes about arrests or political offenses, much less petitions. Petitions only for specific things, like I mentioned this example of the loss of citizenship, because as it is true that you find the petitions always at the archive of the recipient, it's also true that certain recipients only got them for certain purposes. So, for example, the police was handling passports and citizenships in Nazi Germany. So they would get these kind of requests, while the city government gets requests about other things like segregation, welfare, labor, and so on. So it depends very much really on the content of the petition and the kind of authority which is responsible for this. So, and sometimes it's more across the border when they directly wrote to Hitler because they thought he has the sole authority, or the example I cited with his deputy Hess. And then petitions and what they say about the regime. That's a really good question. And I'm kind of don't really know how to phrase this. I think on the one hand, I think they show that we sometimes have a very simplistic understanding of what the Nazi regime actually was. And what my research showed also beyond the petitions is there was much more room for maneuver for individuals in certain offices and institutions, but also because of the still existing legislation. Then we sometimes assume. So because we look back and we see concentration camps, we see deportations, and then it is not really, it is easy to assume there was no room anymore for any opposition. There was no room for any perpetrator to act differently. But I think this is also something which we need to explore much more in depth. I found examples where one judge in a court in Hamburg acquitted a Jewish woman who ran into a police station in 1941 and yelled at the police officer, "Down with Hitler." She was immediately arrested. She was tried for offenses against the Nazi state, and the judge acquitted her. Oh no, not acquitted. He gave her only 2 weeks in prison. Normally it would have been 6 months. Because he writes in his judgment that she acted out of despair. The same judge kind of punished other Jews before and after, who also kind of protested in public against the Nazis with much harsher sentences. So there is an individual room for maneuver, and sometimes it depends on the constellation. Sometimes it depends on different situations, as I mentioned earlier with 1938. So there are all these different kind of influences which kind of affect a certain kind of attitude or behavior of individuals. And this is true for the perpetrators as well as for the victims.
Do the non-Jewish petitions also have expressions of patriotism
to
the extent that the Jewish ones do?
Yeah.
And finally, can the petitions be viewed online anywhere?
No, but it's a good idea. I mean, yeah, thanks for the kind of idea. So more work, I guess. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.